We are back with another installment of Giant Reviews. This time trying to, I think, if I can finish Necropolitics in a reasonable time, because a lot of people, let's just say the first installment didn't go over very well, even though you people wanted this. I remember specifically on stream, you people demanded that I review this book before I reviewed Art After Metaphysics. But I will have to sell Art After Metaphysics as a... Well, I don't know. I mean, the red book one will be like a course. But anyways, this is the Giant Review Part 2 of Necropolitics. We didn't get through the first chapter, which is, because I want to focus on the actual meat of the book, which starts in Necropolitics, the self-titled chapter. But we have to get through Exit from Democracy. So I'll try to go through this as quickly as possible. And I think I'm going to skip Society of Enmity. I'm only going to focus on a few parts because really, I'm not going to lie to you guys, okay? I'm not going to lie to you. It's where Mbembe gets his, his most polemical legs are in that chapter. He explicitly goes through the gamut of, typical, left academia talking points about whiteness and colonialism, and the bit, right? You know the bit. I feel like his polemics distract from the overall meat of the book, which is founded in very diverse sources from, Hegel and Agamben and so forth. And Necropolitics explicitly deals with the political implications of Hegel in Western society. But I'm only going to briefly touch on the Society of Enmity because I do feel it's his most polemical chapter, apart from the things that he says about Fanon. But, it really, for the purposes of this review and given, the nature of my audience, it's probably best just to, skip the chapter. At least a huge part of it. But anyways, he talks about the war on, the surge and all that. So, but anyways, moving on, this is the last bit of Exit from Democracy. I was hoping for a a Mulbuggian exit, but we'll see what happens. So I left you off when he ties together Agamben and Fanon, Franz Fanon and Foucault. But this subchapter is called Consuming the Divine. The era's paranoid disposition crystallizes around the grand narratives of the recommencement of the end, apocalypse. Apocalypticism being the modern era, its overall image of thought, its overall pastiche. It's the animating force. Because Mbembe, in a way, the one good point about this text is that, as society regresses into pervasive death denial because of technology, because of the attitudes people have towards life and death, towards secularization, Mbembe says that it leads to more a strange backdoor re-divinization through the auspices of death itself, meaning that we can never truly escape, that death hangs over in the air. And if you've lived through the past 2 years, 3 years actually, then this feeling of the politics of life and death being constantly and incessantly nagging at you. But of course, he wrote this before the global biosecurity incident, but, very few things seem to distinguish the time of recommencement of the end, since enabling both our destruction, catastrophe, and devastation. From the point of view, domination is exerted by modeling the threshold of catastrophe. So then he talks about the Judeo-Greek heritage and philosophy. But this is an important point. He brings Heidegger. So it goes to reach its epigogue, or apogee. So I always struggle with that word apogee, but, apogee. Being must pass through the phase of purification by fire. This singular event prefigures the last act, that during which, in Heidegger's terms, the earth will blow itself up. This self-blowing up represents, in his eyes, supreme accomplishment of technology, right? That's the end goal. That's the terminus. To have dominion over all life is akin to the destruction of all life. I think that's why in Der Spiegel, the very last interview he gave before he died, that's probably why Heidegger said only a God can save us now. But, you know, of technology, a term that for the German philosopher refers too much to science as to capital. So the relation between capital and techne, we know, I mean, it's complicated, but we know its mechanism. It operates in the same way. It evolves in the same way. The sort of co-committal paths of techne, technique, technology, and capital. So will blow up itself as an actual humanity will disappear along with it. Now for a part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the disappearance of, we know the problem with that term, but anyways. The disappearance of actual humanity is in no way represented an intermittable loss that opens up to the void. It merely signals the end of the first beginning and potentiality, and potentially the start of another beginning in another history of another humanity in a different world. But I think Mbembe, the problem is that he sort of equates Heidegger with the dominator ego as embracing it. Now, you could say that the sort of reactionary modernism of, the particular painter of Austrian's regime that Heidegger was affiliated with, you could say that, in a way, it was clearing a former negotiation of humanity into another form of humanity, which is specifically rooted in, racialism, you know what I mean. But I think that Heidegger himself, by the time he gets to the question of technology, concerning technology, I think that he's perhaps Mbembe, for a rhetorical point, is critiquing Heidegger as embracing it rather than critiquing it. Because at the end of the question, we all know that there's sort of an operatic ending. There's sort of an ambiguity as to what Heidegger proposes as the solution to the question. So I think perhaps Mbembe is filling in the gaps here, but that's just my own personal critique. Again, I'm no scholar in any of this. This is my observation from reading different people. But anyways, moving on from so I'm skipping, again, I'm going to skip the chapters here, the paragraphs. From this point of view, history's creation consists in untying and retying the knots and potentials of situations. Potentiality. History is a succession of paradoxical situations of transformation without rupture, of transformation in continuity, of reciprocal assimilation of multiple segments of that which lives. When all is said and done, this obsession may well be specific to Western metaphysics. For many human cultures, the world simply does not end. The idea of recapitulation of time corresponds to nothing at all precise. This does not mean that all is eternal, that all is repetition, or that all is cyclical. It simply means that the world, by definition, is opening, and that time arises only in and through the unexpected, the unforeseen. As a result, the event is precisely that which nobody can foresee, measure, or calculate with accuracy. This being so humankind's specificity is to be in constant state of wakefulness, disposed to welcoming the unknown and to embrace the unexpected. So that moving on. At another level, for the large share of humanity, the end of the world has already occurred. The question is no longer to know how to live life while awaiting it. Instead is to know how to live life that will be possible the day after the end. That is to say, how to live with loss, with separation. How can the world be recreated in the wake of the world's destruction? For this share of humanity, a loss of the world obligates the undoing of that which hitherto has constituted the essential aspect of material, psychic, and symbolic investments to develop an ethics of renunciation in relation to what there was yesterday. The end does not amount to the ultimate limit of life. Something to the principle of life defies all idea to the end. So I'm going to explain these few pages, but let's skip on. That said, the era is to decide one of double movement. On the one hand, it involves an enthusiasm for origins and recommitment. On the other hand, an exit from the world and end of times, bringing the existing to an end and the coming of another world. Both forms of enthusiasm naturally adopt specific figures depending on the place. In the post-colony, where a particular form of power rages, wherein the dominant and the subjugated are specifically linked to one another by some same bundles of desires and enthusiasms for the end, is often expressed in the language of the religious. One is the post-colony is a relative specific form of capture and emasculation of the desire for revolt and the will to struggle. Society's energies are reinvested not necessarily in work, profit seeking, or the recapitulation of the world and its renewal, but in some sort of immediate enjoyment. And he talks about Hegel, but I will get to that point. So there's a few things that Mbembe is trying to juggle here. He's saying that on the one hand, and see, this is why he says at the beginning of the book that you really have to read it as like interlacing, and you have to start and stop. Very similar to McLuhan in some ways, where each chapter sort of where each chapter doesn't develop onto each other, but rather they're standalone chapters that you can go into and consume at leisure and so forth. But what he's trying to do here is quite interesting, because he sees the development of technology as a way of bringing about a form of apocalyptic consciousness. This is the essence of necropolitics. Technique and techne have allowed for the immense subjugation of whole populations, biopower, governmentality, you name it. Necropolitics is the logical extension, which we'll get into. But he's saying that for the most of the world in the global south, you have to really think of it that way, though. As much as I know, like, right-wingers don't want to hear it, but a lot of these people kind of do live in the end times. Not in the way that we live in a sort of moral, spiritual, civilizational end times. They experience a material deprivation. And they largely consist at the whims of the global West, right? And so he's saying that, this is what he means. So before he gets to the analysis, the book is sort of jumbled in that he's saying that the possibility of a new ethics, a new renewal of humanity is there. And then we'll see this with the Fanon chapter. But before he gets to that, he has to, in the next subsequent chapters, explicate what necropolitics is. But he's leaving open that possibility. Because he's saying, well, Westerners are sort of uniquely obsessed with the end times, and the stereotype of the East is that they have cyclical time, or eternal time, or repetition. There really is no ending, for example, in Buddhism. There really is no... there is a form of apocalypse in some folk traditions within Buddhism. I mean, the Ramayana has a form of it, but really Western consciousness is seized by the sort of Christian biblical narrative of rapture, end times. And this has even bled into Western philosophy and has bled into Western sort of ways of living. And now it's uniquely within our consciousness. Mbembe is saying that most people don't have that, or rather, other people throughout the world don't have that same consciousness. They already kind of live in a stasis. They already kind of live in deprivation. And so he's saying now that populations are moving around the world, the repopulating of the earth, then you bring in the post-human. Then you bring in the sort of post-Eurocentric knowledge system that, only capitulates to the universalization of liberalism, which he gets into in Society of Enmity, but then he sort of, smears it with a bunch of, like, typical anti-white academies, but, it is what it is. But I think that it's quite interesting, these 2 pages, but I will have to move on. I'm almost done this chapter. So, then he gets into Hegel. The enthusiasm for origins thrives by provoking it. So then another thing, too, is he's saying that as things decay, we also have this sort of, like, return to tradition consciousness or enthusiasm for our origins. And, of course, he says this is bad. But, you could see why. You could see why nostalgia becomes a recourse, a source of reprieve, you could say. The enthusiasm for origins thrives by provoking affective fear of encountering the other, an encounter that is not always material, but is certainly phantasmic and in general traumatic. Indeed, many are, well, it's funny he admits that it's traumatic, indeed, many are concerned that they have preferred others over themselves for a long time. They deem that the matter can no longer be prefer such others to ourselves. Everything is now but about preferring ourselves to others, who in any case are scarcely worthy of us, and last about making our object choice settle on those who are not like us. The error is therefore... So again, it's funny, he's almost implicitly admitting that terminal altruism and, global liberalism, that really, that's probably not going to be the way of the future. That's so self-limiting and defeating that it's, by definition, cannot exist within the sort of lizard brain self-preservation of humanity. So, Of course, he says it's a bad thing, I mean, we are dealing with, like, modern academia here, but anyways. Context of functions, imaginary fixation on the stranger, the Muslim, the veiled woman, the refugee, the certain other ethnic group, he says the gamer word, African American, play in defensive ones. There's a refusal to recognize that in truth our ego has always been constituted through the opposition to some other that we have internalized, African American, that certain other person, an Arab, a foreigner, but in a regressive way. But at the bottom, we are made up of diverse borrowings from foreign subjects that consequently we have been beings of the border. In addition to generalizing, democratizing of the effects of fear taking place, backdrop by the deep mutations for starters in our regimes of beliefs and consequently about in the stories that people tell themselves. These stories are, so again, he's like saying we've always been multicultural, and that's, it's bad that we're going backwards, that the world's repopulating, therefore fear is our mechanism, the right wing, xenophobia, I don't mean to be, mocking or pedantic, but this is pretty much, is what you're gonna get. So then he finally caps off with relation without desire in the chapter Exit from Democracy. He talks about how desire fuels into global terrorism and so forth, and how that presupposes and prefigures an image of the other. Terrorist activism and anti-terrorist mobilization have more than one thing in common. Both strike the law and rights at the very root. Terrorist project aims to effect the collapse of a society of rights whose deepest foundations it is objectively threatens. On the other, anti-terrorist mobilization relies on the idea that extraordinary measures alone will enable enemies to be overcome. The state of violence ought to be able to bear down on the enemies unreservedly, to protect the state of law, the nomos of a society. Again, he's talking about, enhanced interrogation, by all means necessary, blah, blah, blah. The sort of 2000s era politics of anti-terrorism. But there's something interesting here. Are we not in the presence of an entirely different political regime whenever the suspect of law and freedoms is no longer an exception, even if in addition, nor is it the rule? Where does justice stop and where does vengeance begin when the law decrees, searches, checks, special tribunals? This is pretty standard stuff, but so moving on. And then I'm going to close out the chapter before you move on to necropolitics. Then he talks about the role of violence. So, he talks about like the global war on terror. In Africa in particular, terror itself donned its several forms. The first was state terror and so forth, and different sort of extrajudicial enhanced methods of countering them, in governance by terror and so forth. So moving on. But here's the sort of pertinent point before we get to the end of the chapter. Terror and atrocities are justified by the desire to eradicate the corruption of which still existing tyrannies are allegedly guilty. In appearance, terror and atrocities thus form part of an immense therapeutic liturgy. Therapeutic liturgy, that's a good term for it. Mixed in with which is the desire for sacrifice, messianic eschatologies, the debris of knowledge forms linked either to native imaginations of the occult or to modern discourses of utilitarianism, materialism, consumerism. They hate us for our freedoms. They hate us for our right to consume product. That's why they hate us, right? The attrition of wars during which thousands, indeed hundreds of thousands of victims are massacred. Hundreds of thousands of survivors are either displaced, confined, or interned against. The surveillance of bodies, the subjugation of people, the authoritarian period, surveillance of bodies, agglomerating them within parameters and controls. This is done not so much to discipline them as to extract a maximum of utility from them and sometimes forms of enjoyment, notably with human trafficking. Can't say the word, but of the particular variety. So he's saying that there's sort of a glee in this, in that I would say that all modern policing efforts of anti-terrorism has that sort of, let's call it jeu de sens or enjoyment and desire involved. Now I would say, like, when what Mbembe wouldn't say is that, this is being brought inward against an entirely different demographic, no longer Muslims, but of course, he's writing this with the mind of like those 2000s era, Bush, Obama era politics. But, all of it is the desire for completion in a system like an antibody pursuing a virus, put it that way. There's a sort of desire in it. So this is, I would say, I'm going to read this last part because honestly, the very last chapters are sort of pedantic. There's two major chapters I'll read. So page 38 is pretty important. As a result, such death, so he talks about the politics of death and life and terrorism and so forth. This life is superfluous one, therefore, whose price is so meager it has no equivalence, whether market or even less human. This is a species of life whose value is extra economic, the only equivalent of which is a sort of death able to inflict upon it. So he's talking about states of exception. He's talking about the Agambian, Homo Sacer, the Muslim, bare life itself. These people are rendered outside of the law. They cannot even be bought and sold. They need to be eliminated, right? And different groups are tagged with this Homo Sacer status. So, as a rule, such death is something which nobody feels any obligation to respond. Nobody even bears the slightest feeling of responsibility or justice towards this sort of life, or rather death. Necropolitical power proceeds by a sort of inversion between life and death, as if life was merely death's medium. It even seeks to abolish the distinction between means and ends. Hence its indifference to objective signs of cruelty. In the eyes of crime constitutes a fundamental part of revelation. The death of its enemies is in principle deprived of all symbolism. To a large extent, racism is the driver of necropolitical principle insofar as it stands for organized destruction, for a sacrificial economy, the functioning of which requires, on the other hand, a generalized cheapening of the price of life, and on the other hand, habituation to loss. This principle is at work in the present-day process of which permanent simulation. The state of exception justifies war against terror, the war of eradication, indifferent, absolute, the claim to right to cruelty. So he's very much reiterating the sort of Agambian analysis, right? I mean, we can quibble over the, origins of racism, but, this is the fundamental point that he's getting at. He talks about how today's victim is tomorrow's executioner, how this cycle never ends. We see in the Middle East, the more you bomb them, the more you destroy the father, the son becomes radicalized, so on and so forth. But of course, we know that lesson on the outside, but when it comes to demonizing enemies of the regime on the inside, well, we don't learn that lesson, because the chud that, the father that you jail for being, for wrongthink, the little chudling, maybe I guess he won't get radicalized anymore like the Muslim in the Middle East, right? But anyways, that's my own personal bias, but you get the point of necropolitics. You get, now he's getting into the theoretical sort of scaffolding of it. And then he goes in explicitly into Hegel. So the last chapter in Exit from Democracy, so notice that all of this constitutes the state of exception for global democracies, is that Homo Sacer. It is the zone of life and death, where death is the premium, whereas the only thing that matters, you can't even buy or sell these people the way you can buy or sell a wagey and a cagey. It is like little wagey Amazon labor cagey. They're even worse than that, so meaning that when you have a sort of population that is subject to that exception, that not even base capitalist economic principles extend to them, then you know that that is the politics of death. Because death is the zone of non-operation in this world. Maybe some crazy Bill Gates person will find, Klaus Schwab will find a way to extend capitalism into the realm of death. Maybe he already has, through some kind of necromancy. But anyways, the point being is the fact that capital does not even extend to them. You can't even buy or sell them or their wares. Means that they are fundamentally outside of the law, of civilization, of humanity even. So, owing to the structure of proximity, there's no longer any outside that might be opposed to an inside, no elsewhere that might be opposed to a here, no closeness that might oppose to remoteness. One cannot sanctuarize one's own home by forming chaos and death far away in the homes of others. Necropolitics is everywhere. It brings into our life. The past 2 years, hello? The necropolitical will extend to everywhere. not just in a faraway land like it was in the 2000s, right? Sanctuarization can only ever be mutual. To achieve this, we are going to have to think through democracy beyond the juxtaposition of singularities as much as beyond the simplistic ideology of integration. In addition, a democracy to come will rely on a clear-cut distinction between the universal and the in common. The universal implies inclusion in some already constituted thing or entity, whereas in common presupposes a relation of co-being and sharing, the idea of a world that is only one that we have, and that to be sustainable must be shared by all those with rights to it, blah, blah, blah. So species together. It kind of ends on hippy-dippy note, but let's examine that, meaning that we know that in this world, either global terror or, certain medical states of exception or globalization in general, no longer are these things in colonies. Those same politics of death are now in our civilizations. And of course, Mbembe would say that racism is also a part of this, right? Of course, he's writing this about, let's face it, he's writing this during, right before the Trump era, or during. So, he would say that because these pressures of death in the political are no longer something that is unique to another location, another geography, something that can be externalized to the other wholly, but now it is part of ourselves as well. Now you can't ignore it. Now it's within the home, and sort of the sanctuarization, the way that, Britain was, well, until the colonized people, mass immigrated to Britain. That's a perfect example. I wanted to mention, what was it called? The documentary that, before Trauma Zone, the documentary that Adam Curtis did. What was it called? I forget its title, but it was about the one part where, the British people relied on, like in the 70s, were like xenophobic. It was like because they were afraid and they were defeated, and it was after their empire and so forth, and how they capitulated to a form of xenophobia because of their fear that, and then colonial peoples went to the heartland, right, of the empire, and like, wow, these people, they're sort of, very spiritually, morally, physically defeated, right? So there was that one part in Adam Curtis's documentary. But the point being is that the colonialization went into the sacred sanctuary of the homeland, of the motherland. The sort of the periphery moving inwards. The war on terror is like that. Mbembe would say other states of exception are like that. Is very much intimate and within our home. But anyways, let's move on to Necropolitics. The chapter, I mean. So I think a prudent way to start off the chapter of the self-titled chapter of Necropolitics will be to actually start from the very last page, which is the summary of the book. I believe Mbembe probably wrote this essay before the whole book was contextualized. But let me read. In this chapter, I have argued that contemporary forms of subjugating life to the power of death, necropolitics, are deeply reconfiguring the relationships between resistance, sacrifice, and terror. He talks a lot about, terrorism in this section. I have demonstrated that the notions of biopower is insufficient to account for contemporary forms of the subjugation of life to the power of death. So biopower alone in the sustaining of life is not adequate for today's experiences. Moreover, I have put forward the notion of necropolitics or necropower to account for various ways in which, in our contemporary world, weapons are deployed in the interests of maximally destroying persons and creating death worlds. That is, new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to living conditions that confer upon them the status of the living dead. Very metal, by the way, some chapters he describes. I'm also a fan of the rapper Necro, but anyways, I have also outlined some of the repressed typographies of cruelty, the plantation and the colony in particular, and suggested that today's forms of necropolitics and necropower blurs the lines between resistance and, this is still the YouTube portion, resistance and heroing, sacrifice, redemption, martyrdom, and freedom. So for YouTube purposes, the paywalled version will talk about the the reality of the sunset ism. So Anyways, this is chapter 3, Necropolitics. I think there's only a few parts of the Society of Enmity that are really important. One of them where he talks about space and capitalism and geography, but also the sort of mixing of desire and subjugation. But then, again, like I said, it's the most polemical, so it sort of detracts from the work overall. But this is the beginning. So this is the beginning of Necropolitics. The ultimate expression of sovereignty largely resides in the power and capacity to dictate who is able to live and who must die. To let live the constituent sovereignties limits its principal attributes. To be sovereign is to exert one's own control over mortality, to define life as the deployment and manifestation of power. This sums up what Michel Foucault meant by biopower, the dominant life over which power has asserted its control, but under which practical conditions the power to redact, to let live, or to expose to death exercised. Who is to be subject to this right? What does the implementation of such right tell us about the whole? So, in a way, we're reintroducing sovereign power. That is Mbembe's point, is that Foucault's dichotomy of biopower versus, the ancient regime, the older pre-modern forms of sovereign power, which is the power of life and over death. That biopower is something that sustains life, because in this chapter, what is very interesting, he weds together Foucault with Hegel, with Heidegger, and with Bataille a little bit. And he says that that ancient form of sovereignty, that's actually being reintroduced in the modern world, which is the power of life over death. And of course, Schmitt hides in the background of all of this. I mean, he even admits as such, right? So this is the chapter, The Work of Death. The answer to the questions essay draws on the concept of biopower and explores this concept. The Austrian painter regime, totalitarianism, fascism, communism. Violence as the ultimate sign of the absolute power of negation in the negative. As Hannah Arendt puts, there are no parallels to life in the concentration camps. Its horror can never be fully embraced by the imagination for the very reason it stands outside of life and death. Because its inhabitants have been divested of political status and reduced to bare life, the camps for Giorgio Gambin is, quote, the place in which most absolute conditio in humanita ever to appear on earth was realized. So, Giorgio Gambin saying that history leads to the camps, that sovereign power is that the Muslim is a being that's bare life itself. There's no history, there's no past, there's no personality, there is just bare necessity of survival. And that role of survival to the Muslim men can be taken away at any time, the homo sacred. So then there's the multiple concept of sovereignty, and thus always of the biopolitical. Discarding this multiplicity, late modern politics, political criticism has unfortunately privileged normative theories of democracy. It made the concept of reason one into the most important element, both the project of modernity and topos of sovereignty. So again, instrumental reason very much leads to these modern atrocities. But we like to think that modern liberal democracies, sort of save us from this. Politics, therefore, and this is where Schmitt comes in, politics, therefore, is doubly defined as a project of autonomy and the reaching of agreement within a collective through communication and recognition. But then who decides, who recognizes what power, what entity as belonging to a politics in a society that is undergirded by the nomos of that society. The law, the nomos, recognizing those populations that are worthy of life within a given body. And so Mbembe takes that sort of Agambian, Schmittian analysis and runs with it. So here comes Hegel now. So the romanticization of sovereignty and so forth. Several critiques have already been addressed by the strong normative reading of my political sovereignty. The struggle for autonomy, but the generalized instrumentalization of human existence and the material destruction of human bodies and populations. Indeed, the death camps, these figures constitute the nomos of the political space which we continue to live. So another big theme to understand necropolitics is that whole populations are instrumentalized in the name of death. Death is the mechanism by which human bodies are instrumentalized into certain ends. Talks about this with the global war on terror. And so the camps represent that you are just a human battery to be expelled. And to be the expenditure of your existence is to be, service the regime for a time, the sovereign, and then you are discarded. So it's the ultimate instrumentalization of life. So the contemporary experience of human destruction suggests that a reading of politics, sovereignty, and the subject may be developed that differs from one bequeathed to us by the philosophic discourse on modernity. So this is where it's sort of like Mbembe leaves that as an aporia. Because I think that, it seems the alternative modes of being, like, for example, one that religion provides, a different form of law that governs a political body that is not subject to the rules of, modern sovereignty. In later chapters, when he talks about Fanon, he explores it a little bit. But to give you a sort of basic reading of this, what a lot of these post-colonial theorists will do is that they will posit that there are alternative ways of governance outside of the sovereign discourse that liberal democracies provide since the Enlightenment. The very standard Enlightenment theory of, well, the sovereign is that who gives the law to each other, that everyone in society, this is Kantian, right? Everyone gives each other the moral law, everyone is subject to the sovereign, everyone gets to decide that they are in a governing body, that this is very much contractual. This is like this is like basic 101 liberal democracy in like Western European, North American, largely, governing bodies. That we live in constitutional democracies or republics or so forth, and that they provide to us the rule of sovereign through the choice, democratic choice, blah, blah, blah. This is like the Enlightenment form of governance by reason. But what happens when reason dictates that there are populations outside of that law that prop up that nomos, that law of society? This is Agamben's point, that there are whole populations subject to the power of life and death that govern these relations within a quote-unquote, reason-based, secular democratic body that comes from the Enlightenment. Of course, this is where the critical theorists are right. This is where James Lindsay, those people refuse to admit it. That there is a powerful critique of the humanism, the secular humanism that comes out of the Enlightenment, that is the basis for modern democratic, quote-unquote, governance. The modern, largely global liberal empire. That demands that if you want to have a society that is governed by principles that are outside of this unipolar entity, like Russia, then you are an enemy of the global empire. You do not want to exist in the sovereign, freedom, rules-based system. But even though that sovereign, secular, supposedly, even though every society is a public religion, has elements that are basically against its own principles, quote unquote, even though when it comes to liberalism, that really doesn't matter. Then they say that, well, actually we dictate what is the rules, who is outside of it, what the rules-based order is, because of our supposedly secular, democratic, reason-based principles. But we all know that's, a lie. But I hope most of you are smart enough to know that that's a lie. That's like the stuff they give you in civics classes, like, the blueprint, but it's not real. But, yeah, anyways. But this is where Hegel comes into the politics of life and death, because life through negation is of vital importance in the Hegelian system. But death is the ultimate negation of life. But death is required for the movement of that system. The sort of, the actual law, the nomos of absolute spirit, requires that negation, requires antithesis, requires chaos to build a more sufficient and lasting order. So here he says, Hegel's discussion of the relation between death and the becoming subject. Because remember, Hegel, like Heidegger, there's vast differences between the two. Because, Hegel is still part of that tradition that Heidegger overturns. But there still is that capacity, I think that's even where Heidegger sort of gets it from, that death individualizes you. Death is required for you as a full subject. Discussion relation between death and becoming subject is significant here. His account of death centers on twofold concept of negativity. First, the human negates nature, a negation that is exteriorized in the human's efforts to reduce nature to human needs, standing reserve in framing the Enlightenment project of man being over and above and conquering nature through reason. Second, the negated element is transformed through work and struggle. By transforming nature, the human being creates a world, but in the process, this human being is also exposed to his own negativity, to death. In the Hegelian paradigm, human death is essentially voluntary. In it is the result of subjects consciously assuming risks, according to Hegel, through the risks of animal that constitutes the human subject nature being defended or defeated. So, in other words, human nature, so the nature of the animal is defeated for something higher because we voluntarily choose self-sacrifice. In other words, human being thus becomes a subject that is separated from the animal. In the struggle and the work through death, understood as violence of negativity, is confronted. Through this confrontation with death, the human is cast into the incessant movement of history. Becoming a subject therefore supposes upholding the work of death. To uphold the work of death, such is precisely how Hegel defines life of the spirit. The life of the spirit, he says, is not the life that is frightened of death and spares itself destruction, but the life that assumes death and lives with it. Spirit attains its truth only by finding itself in absolute dismemberment. So again, this is sort of spirit recognizing itself, but the spirit that works through the human is the recognition of mortality and works through death, self-sacrifice. Remember, one has to always be conquered in the original Hegelian confrontation. One is a master, one is a slave. But death is the glue that holds both of them together. The recognition of limitations of mortality is that which frees the human spirit. That's what becomes human. Death, toil, and struggle are what makes us and constitutes us human. At least the way that is understood in that sort of, Enlightenment framework. Because the way that the Enlightenment has, figures its negation within the pre-Enlightenment. Within, the sort of origin stories of, how we developed into a people that is capable of governance or capable of creating society. Right? So, classic Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. But, Hegel, that original struggle is there. Death is always hovering in the background. But now he transposes this to Bataille, who says that death is the ultimate confrontation. It's the opposite with Bataille. Death brings us to the human level through the sort of excess enjoyment of the subject, through those limited experiences. So Gregor Bataille, or Georges Bataille, also offers critical insights into how death structures the concept of sovereignty, the political and the subject. So it's the opposite in that death brings us towards the natural. But yet we can only affirm sovereignty through being very close to death, according to Bataille. He talks about this in eroticism, right? So the concept of sovereignty, the political and the subject, Bataille displaces Hegel's conception of the linkage between death, sovereignty, and the subject in at least three ways. First, he interprets death and sovereignty as the proximism of exchange and exuberance, and superabundance. The superabundance of energy that is brought about through the limited experience, right? And again, it's almost like a very weird, very, very inverted form of Zen Buddhism in a way. Or to use his own terminology, excess. For Bataille, life is defective only when death has taken it hostage. Life itself exists only in bursts and exchanges with death. He argues that death is the purification of life, the stench that is one's life's source and repulsive condition. So, although it destroys what obliterates what was supposed to continue being, and reduces to nothing the individual who takes it, death does not amount to the pure annihilation of being. Rather, it's essentially self-conscious. Moreover, it is most luxurious form of life that is of efflusion and exuberance, a power of proliferation. Even more radically, Bataille subtracts death from the horizon of meaning. In Hegel, by contrast, nothing is definitely lost in death. Indeed, death for him holds great signification as a means to truth. Secondly, Bataille firmly anchors death in the realm of absolute expenditure, the other characteristic of sovereignty, where Hegel tries to keep death with the economy of absolute knowledge and meaning. Life beyond utility, Bataille says, is the dominance of sovereignty. This being the case, death is therefore the point at which destruction, suppression, sacrifice constitutes so irreversible and radical an expenditure without reserve, that they can no longer be determined as negativity. Death is therefore the very principle of excess and anti-economy. Hence the metaphor of luxury and of luxurious character of death. Third, Bataille establishes a correlation among death, sovereignty, sexuality. Sexuality for him is intrinsically linked to violence and to the dissolution of bodies, and the self's boundaries by the way of orgiastic and excremental impulses. Oh God. As such, sexuality concerns two major forms of polarizing human impulses: exertion and appropriation. So you give yourself while you take something in that sexual act. You take someone else's sexuality while they are also taking yours. It's like the la petite mort, right? The little death. The truth of sex and its deadly attributes resides in the expenditure of loss and of boundaries of separate realities, events, and fantasizing objects. For Bataille, then, sovereignty takes more forms, but it ultimately takes that of a refusal to accept the limits and the fear of death would have the subject respect. The sovereign world, Bataille argues, is the world in which the limits of death is done away with. Death is present in the presence, defines that world of violence, but which death is present in always there only to be negated, never for anything but the sovereign. He concludes that who is as if death were not, he had no more regard for the limits of identity than he does for limits of death. Or rather, these limits are the same. He is the transgression of all such limits. Since the natural domain of prohibitions include death among others, sexuality, filth, and excrement, sovereignty requires the strength to violate prohibitions against redacting, although it's true that this will be under the conditions of customs defined. And contrary to subordination, ever rooted in necessity and the alleged need to avoid death, sovereignty defines cause for the risk of death. By conceiving his sovereignty as a violating of prohibitions, Bataille reopens the question of the limits of the political. The political in this case is not forward dialectical movement of reason. It can be traced only as a spiral transgression, as the difference that disorientates the very idea of the limit, more specifically in the difference put between the play of violation of taboo. So this is very important because let me sort of try to break this down in layman's terms, okay? This is important. I didn't actually highlight it, but then as the more I read, the more it's important, the more we should spend time on it. Because to Mbembe, he takes Bataille and he's saying that, Bataille is a forgotten thinker in some ways, apart from like literature departments and so forth. But he's saying that if you actually look at Bataille, he sort of upends that relation between death and sovereignty, that Western Enlightenment, democratic, reason-based, tradition takes up with Hegel. And he says that, no, actually, the death is always hovering in politics, not because it affirms something, but it negates. It's pure excretion. It's pure exhausting of the subject through that absolute moment of expenditure. If you know anything about Bataille, right? What's interesting is that for Hegel, death is in the process of spirit realizing itself because it is negation that ultimately works towards a higher level of consciousness, a higher level of subjectivity, a higher level of humanity, through sacrifice, through death. But with Bataille, death is, in the negative sense, a pure expenditure. It's excess and waste and death that requires, at that moment, you are pure human. But at the same time, death brings you to the natural. It's very hard to explain, but in that moment of transgression, where you are so close to death that you no longer care about your own mortality, that is the true limit experience. That is pure expenditure. He talks about this with capitalism, talks about this with eroticism, that it brings you to an appropriation and a super abundance of life to the point where you're willing to expel that life into death. Whereas Hegel says that no, death is required, but it's to affirm life qua life. There is a higher being that death brings us towards because we voluntarily sacrifice ourselves. And then, sort of absolute spirit realizes another portion of itself. Humanity becomes more enlightened. Then we negate some more. We hover towards death even more. Then through that comes another synthesis, and onwards and upwards, this sort of upward-centric spiral of absolute spirit. But with Bataille, he's saying that, and this is where the necropolitical comes in. This is what Mbembe is trying to say, is that death is the sort of enjoyment of hovering towards death is within current political regimes. Even though death denial is a huge part of the modern experience, the way that we cordon off death, or we don't like to think about it, we like to think that we've conquered it through our reason, through our medical science, through irreligiosity that, oddly enough, doesn't bring us any comfort when it comes to death, but quite the opposite. The anxiety about it makes us shut it off from our minds. But really, death is all around us in the political, in that determination of sovereignty, of who lives and who dies by the sovereign. And the reason Mbembe brings in Bataille is because, in a way, death is transcendental. It brings us towards a humanity that is uniquely primordial. And that experience is repeated throughout history over and over again. The desire and transgression, because even the Society of Enmity, which I will read later on a little bit, he talks about the desire for all of these, subjugating whole bodies and populations to the power of death. That there is ultimately a transgressive act there. Even though we normalize it through the politics of, regulating life, even though it's in, some CIA black site or whatever, it's like we do this because we have to defend our society, and we have to, regulate the power of death over life, right? But Bataille is interesting because he's saying that if life is always caught in the consciousness of worrying about death, the anxiety about death, and that's not life. That's just that's a form of inauthenticity. That's a form of supreme negation. Whereas to embrace a life that is so geared towards the jeu de sens, the excess of enjoyment, that you're willing to literally expel life itself. That there's so much, chthonic energy there. There's so much exuberance and abundance and excess of being, of life, that the ultimate expulsion is to literally risk one's own death. So that's, again, the classic, Bataille. But there are political regimes that do this, you could say. You could say the Austrian painter was, an example that Mbembe uses, of a society so driven by the excess and the exuberance of trying to achieve a fullness of life that they would literally risk the death of their whole civilization in this ultimate final apocalyptic war. Well, that's not to romanticize it, but this is what a lot of people have taken from, the works of Hannah Arendt and so forth. That in order for the sovereign to choose life over, who lives and who dies, is to bring the regime, that nomos of a society, so close to that heightened experience of life that is very close to death, in these various states of exception. And so whole populations are now subject to this power. So anyways, moving on. So here, this subchapter is called The Relation of Enmity. It talks about Arendt and the experience of otherness. Foucault clearly posits that sovereign right of the sword and the mechanism of biopower is part of the functioning of all modern states. Indeed, they can be seen as constitutive elements of state power in modern modernity. According to him, the Austrian painter regime was the most complete example of states exercising the right to redact. Here's a biological extrapolation of themes of the political enemy. The Austrian painter state organizing of war against its adversaries and simultaneous exposing of its own citizens to war opens the way for a formidable consolidation of the right to redact, culminating in the project of the final solution. So he says before, here I relate the notion of Foucault's biopower to two concepts, the state of exception, the state of siege. Examine the trajectory by which the state of exception and the relation of enmity have been the normative basis of the right to redact. In such instances, power, which is not necessarily a state of power, continuously references and appeals to the exception, emergency, and a fictionalized notion of the enemy. So again, you must create that state of exception within a society in order to function, in order to bring a truly necropolitical order to its crescendo. So he talks about, the Austrian painter regime, But then, of course, this relates back to colonialism and imperialism. And in fact, it was the British that created the first concentration camps. But then he talks about, terrorism. Terror thus becomes a way of marking aberrations in the body politic. Politics come to be read both as the mobile force of reason and an errant attempt to create a space where error would only be reduced and thus truth enhanced and the enemy displaced. Finally, terror is not linked solely to the utopian belief in an unfettered power of human reason. It is also clearly related to various narratives of mastery and emancipation, most of which are underpinned by Enlightenment understandings of truth and error, the real and the symbolic. Marx, for example, conflates labor, the endless cycle of production, consumption required to maintain human life, with work, the creation of lasting artifacts that add to the world of things. Labor is viewed as the vehicle of humankind's historical self-creation. The historical self-creation is in itself life and death conflict over paths might lead to the truth of history, overcoming capitalism and the commodity form and the contradictions associated with each other. According to Marx, with the advent of communism and the abolition of exchanges of relations, thus will appear as the really are. The real will present itself is as if actually is the distinction between subject and object. So again, this is sort of like, he's talking about how the instrumentalization of reason reduces life to these exchanges of commodity, right? Like this is basic Marxism 101. That you are a vehicle of surplus value. That as the factory, as sort of like old classical Fordism and now like in the post-industrial economy, you are reduced down to that relation of that thing. You are an instrument of the economy rather than you being an instrument in the, you utilizing work to your advantage. It necessitates all life for you. And so it sort of strips your being of a form of subjectivity where you are in charge of your own value, right? So this is like basic Marxism. But he also says that, in this chapter, he says that really violence is the only way that in which Marxism can achieve its ends. But then as we see in like actual Marxist societies throughout history, they still have this politics of death and expulsion and, labor camps and so forth. It may be argued, so the commitment to the abolition of commodity production and the dream of direct and immediate access to the real, meaning that your real value, you are abstracted, again, this is classic Marxism, you are abstracted from those relations of production. You no longer have that access to what you are actually creating in this long Fordish chain of production. You're just like, you're inserting a cog, and that's it. You don't actually have a relation to the final product of the thing. So, immediate access, the fulfillment of so-called logic of history and the fabrication of humankind also necessarily violence precedes. Meaning that, again, to become a full subject in the Marxist picture of the self, it's like, violence is the ensuring of that. Then, of course, you have the dictatorship of the proletariat. Then you have the, full communism, where you can't be a real subject because unless you get rid of capitalism, right? You can't really be a true species being with value and dignity and so forth. Of course, Marxism shares a lot of basis with his, Enlightenment contemporaries. Like they have this, him and the liberals have the same assumptions about like freedom and sovereignty and the emancipation of the self, ironically enough, right? So it may be argued that they have aimed at eradicating the basic human condition of plurality, indeed the overcoming of class divisions, with the eating away of the state, the flowering of true general will, all presupposes a view of human plurality as the chief obstacle to eventual realization of predominated telos of history. Again, Marxist teleology, right? Like the absolute state of, communism. In other words, the subject of Marxism and Marxian modernity is fundamentally a subject which is intent on proving his or her sovereignty by staging a fight to the death. Similarly to Hegel and this Hegelian influence of Marxism, the narrative of mastery and emancipation here is clearly linked to the narrative of truth and death. Terror and redacting become the means of realizing the already known teleos of history. Then he talks about like how slave labor is required in colonies and so forth. And then he says, in spite of this terror and symbolic sealing off, the slave maintains alternative prospects towards time, work, and self. This is the second paradoxical element of the plantation world, as manifested the state of exception. The slave treated as no longer existing except as mere tool and instrument of production, is nevertheless able to introduce almost any object, instrument, language, or gesture into performance, then stylizing it. So he talks about how there were various like fighting rituals and various spiritual songs and so forth, ways in which slaves felt a sort of inner emancipation in basically them being reduced to an instrument, where their time is not their own, their bodies are not their own, nothing of them is truly themselves. But yet they still manage to resist that in these sort of micro forms of emancipation, in even these small gestures. Then he talks about, the plantation system, but also he talks about, very interesting about Schmidt and Foucault. Then the technologies which produced the Austrian painter regime originated in the plantation, the colony. It's Foucault's thesis, Austrian painter ideology and Stalinism actually only amplified series of already existing mechanisms of Western European social political formations. So again, we all know his point is, clearly against European civilization. But I guess, it is true that we like to think that these ideologies are aberrations. But really, if you look at the history of it, there are linkages there that exist within the Enlightenment mindset. And that's the whole point. That's like the whole critical theory point. That the libs hate hearing. I mean, the classic libs, the woke centrists. They hate hearing this point. They think it's nonsense, but, that really, these regimes are not that dissimilar from ours. Indeed, this view is in keeping with the definition of sovereignty that Carl Schmitt forged at the beginning of the 20th century, one that sees it as the power to decide in the state of exception. European imagination itself is related to the critical issue of the domestication of war and the creation of European judicial order, jus publius Europeanum. Two key principles lay at the basis of this order. The first postulate, the juridical equality of all states, and the equality that was notably applied to the right to wage war, the taking of life. The right to wage war meant two things. On the one hand, the redacting or concluding peace was recognized as one of the preemptive functions of any state. This function went hand in hand with the recognition that no state could make claim to rule outside of its borders. This is a classic Westphalian sovereignty. The second principle is related to the territorialization of the sovereign state, that is, the determination of its borders within the context of a newly imposed global order. In this order, just publicum rapidly assumed the form of a distinction between, on the one hand, those parts of the globe available for colonial appropriation, and on the other hand, Europe, whose just publicum was to hold sway. This distinction, as we will see, is crucial in terms of asserting the colony's efficacy as a structure of terror. Under jus publicum, a legitimate war is largely a war conducted by one state against another. But as we see, that this is no longer the norm. So then moving on, the colonies could be ruled, and absolute lawlessness was due to the racial denial of any common bond between the conqueror and the native. In the conqueror's eyes, savage life is just another form of animal life. A horrifying experience, something alien beyond imagination or comprehension. In fact, according to Arendt, what makes savages different from one another human beings is less the color of their skin than the fear that they behave like part of nature, that they treat nature as their undisputed master. For nature thereby remains in all its majesty and overwhelming reality, compared to which they applied to the phenomenon unreal and ghost-like. Savages, as it were, natural human beings who lack a specifically human character, a specific human reality. So in other words, he talks about colonial warfare being total warfare against populations. And then we get to a very interesting chapter called Necropower in Occupation in Late Modernity. So, that has a lot of... he talks a lot about that one nation Middle East, which I might have to skip ahead. But so, in other words, when it comes to classic Westphalian sovereignty of states recognizing each other and that you can only go to war as a state actor against another state actor. He's saying that there was always these spaces of indeterminacy in the colonies, in these subject populations, that are not governed by those laws of sovereignty. They literally lie outside of the will of the sovereign. They are a pure state of exception. They do not have a rulership over their own ability to be recognized, because they are like forces of nature. They are like, it's sort of like populations nowadays. It's like they're a force of nature. They're uniquely, they're not individuated as persons. They're of a mass. They operate in the shadows. They can get you at any time, and that therefore they must be rooted out. That they don't have a claim to that sovereignty. They are the state of exception that lies outside of the law, outside of the nomos. And essentially, to Mbembe, necropolitics operates as that exception. It hovers around. It's the expulsion of populations that constitute a sort of excess that is there as a form of like pure being, to purify oneself, to maintain the order of that law, that nomos, is to expel those populations. But let me talk a little bit about the Society of Enmity, certain passages that I will cover. Then we will get to the second part of Necropolitics before we go to break. So again, he talks about the object of desire as ultimately what holds all of this together. Perhaps it's always been this way. Perhaps democracies have always been communities of fellow beings, and therefore, as I maintain in the previous chapter, Society of Separation, they may have always been slaves, a set of people who, in other words, are regarded as pertaining to the foreigner, members of surplus populations. Equally possible that no universal democracy of humanity has ever existed anywhere on Earth, and thus the Earth being divided into states, as within the such states, one seeks to realize democracy. So again, I mean, this is classic, New Left attack on what is like sort of that classic model of states, that doesn't really serve humanity, right? So very much like a post-state sovereignty model that they're going at. But the contemporary era is undeniably one of separation, hate movements, hostility, above all, struggle against an enemy. Consequently, liberal democracies, already considerably leached by the forces of capital, technology, and militarism, are now being sucked into a colossal process of inversion. So he talks about this chapter called The Terrifying Object, that in fact, desire produces that other that we must expel. Again, this is, classic New Left thinking, but movement necessary, thus energy is enlisted, whereas consciously or not, the pursuit of desire, ideally a master desire, this master desire at once comprising a field of immanence and the force of composed multiplicity, invariably has one or several objects fixation point. Yesterday, the African American or the other, certain Middle Easterner were the favored name for such objects. Today, those people are known by other names: Islam, the Muslim, the Arab, the foreigner. Desire, master or otherwise, is also the movement through which the subject envelops on all sides by specific fantasy, sometimes seeks to turn back on itself in the hopes of protecting itself from external danger. So ablation, destruction, persecution, it matters little. Sometimes goes outside of itself to confront the windmills of its imagination, henceforth assail it. In fact, once uprooted by its structure, desire sets out to conquer this terrifying object. But since this object has never actually existed, does not and never will exist, desire must continually invent it. Dreaming it up, however, still does not work to make it real, except a sort of empty yet bewitched space, a hallucination zone, at once enhanced and evil, its inhabitants a sort of fate. That inhabits a sort of fate. The desire for an enemy is the desire for apartheid. So again, he's saying that, of course he means that, like, viewing these populations as, sort of replacing one's own and so forth, that's a fantasy, that, like, the right wing, the colonizer, they invent these populations as enemies. Then he talks about apocalypticism and catastrophism. He talks about the Palestinian body as well. But it is true that modern regimes must invent a picture of the enemy as being ubiquitous, faceless, ever-present, and must be rooted out and destroyed. That's the basic point that he's driving at. So I will talk about the Society of Enmity. I shall go to break now. And now, because he talks about some kind of, let's call it non-monetizable things, both in here and the later chapters of Necropolitics. But the final bit in the chapter on Necropolitics talks specifically about his relation to Hegel, Heidegger, and so forth. And so when we come back from break, I will finish Society of Enmity, but I'll also finish the chapter on Necropolitics that you will be able to find in the paywalled version. Because again, a lot of this stuff is, let's say, non-monetizable. So I'm going to give you a new selection of Philip Daniel now. So I'll see you on the other side.